Hello, welcome to Secure Talk, your trusted source of information on the latest threats, trends, tools, and technology related to cybersecurity and compliance.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Secure Talk. My name is Mark Schreiner, and I'll be your host for this episode of Secure Talk. Today, we're going to be talking with Eric Kudrowski, who is the CISO at Sunre Security. And we're going to be talking to Eric about some best practices related to building a cloud risk management strategy and how best to determine and reduce your blast radius. We may talk about some other things as well, but before we do that, let's say hi to Eric. Eric, how are you today?
Not too bad, Mark. Hello, everybody.
Hey. So, and whereabouts are you located?
I'm actually located in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, way up in Canada. So,
Wow. Has spring arrived yet?
Spring in Newfoundland is an interesting concept. So it has not arrived, but this is iceberg season. So many icebergs have arrived. So it's quite beautiful this time.
Are you serious? You actually see real legit icebergs?
Yes. Oh yeah. I went for a cruise last night in a car, and you can go park by the ocean and you can watch these big, giant, massive icebergs float by. Yeah.
Do you guys ever take a small craft out and try to climb on the icebergs? Is that not recommended?
No, that's not recommended. I was just saying to a friend that every year you see a posting on the news where someone goes to try to do that. But what happens is the icebergs can calf, which means they can break apart or flip over. And every year you see some video where somebody goes out like a motorboat, with an engine behind it, and they get too close to an iceberg and it calves. And as you can imagine, these things are massive, and the waves that they create can be quite dangerous. So they're best to be viewed from quite a distance.
Yeah. Sounds like a great drunken pastime for... No, not recommended. You didn't hear it here.
No,
hey.
No.
So
a risk management strategy, don't go too close to icebergs.
And for most of the people in the world, that's never an issue. But if you're up in Newfoundland, yes. Hey, Eric, before we get into talking about cloud risk management, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what Sunre does.
Yeah, so Sunre Security is a cloud security platform. And we take it in four pieces, right? We believe that identity and data security need to be at the core of your cloud security strategy. And I believe we're going to talk, more about that today. And one of the other things we're going to talk about today is what I'll call risk and context. And we'll talk about in the context of the blast radius, but really, putting it together, your vulnerabilities on your workloads, the security risks of your identities, protecting your data, and then the overall configuration of your platform. And so we put that all together and really pinpoint what are the most important risks across your cloud and clouds, so across your multi-cloud environments, to really say, of the hundreds of things, thousands of things that pop up from a risk perspective, these are the really, really important 5-10 things you should focus on to enable you to fix the real problems in your cloud and not just be chasing, as I like to say, gophers or ghosts in an area where you're never getting anything done.
So creating awareness and then prioritizing in terms of what you find. And I guess that's kind of just a nice little segue if we didn't actually answer the question, but why don't you talk about what is a cloud risk management strategy, why it's important, and what are some of the key tenets of that?
Well, I think, I've been doing this information security stuff for 20 years. I did it coming right out of engineering school. The idea of risk management is not new to anybody that's been around this for 6 months or 60 years. But in the cloud, the paradigms have kind of shifted from the move from the data center into the cloud. And so when you're thinking about your risk strategy in the cloud, I like to talk about it in those four pillars. Identity and data, again, are at the core. And that's where you have to know, what are your identities? What are the end-to-end permissions that they can have within a cloud across multi-cloud environments? What can they do with those permissions? Then you flip the coin and you look at the data perspective. So again, looking at your data risk. Where is my data? Data sprawl in the cloud is a huge problem. But second of all, as part of that strategy, what is my data? And that's a really important question to ask, because are you going to spend lots of time, money, and effort trying to manage risk on data that is not worth very much to your business? Or are you going to want to focus on the stuff that matters? And I don't think anybody has an unlimited budget. So that question is sort of a bit of a given. And then, looking further out from there, what are the vulnerabilities on the workloads in your cloud? Those are going to be the point of entry. So on your EC2s or your VMs or whatever, how are the malicious actors going to get into your environment? And then lastly, the configuration of your cloud, the fourth pillar. Have I configured my cloud in a secure way? And so when you put those pieces together, identity security, data security, workload management, and then platform security, really that's how you should think about a risk management security strategy in your cloud. But again, the key is risk and context. Across any one of those pillars, you're going to have lots of risk. I mean, that's just the state of the world today. What you really need to do is step back and, as I like to say, look at the forest for the trees and say, when I put all those risks together, what are the top 3? What are the top 5 risks that bubble up? And then focus your efforts on solving those problems so you can make a real effort in improving the security of your cloud and not just feel like you're just being overwhelmed by an onslaught of things every single day and not even moving the needle forward.
How does that translate into something a CISO would do their first week on the job? I mean, I can have all those objectives that you just mentioned, but how do I actually go about and do that? And, what's the process and how long does it take?
Yeah, I mean, I think when a CISO comes on the job, the question you need to always be asking yourselves are in each one of those areas. But again, I always start with the identity piece because that really is the key to all of this. Do we have an accurate inventory of the identities in our cloud? And, for any CISOs that are new to the cloud, we're used to thinking of identities in terms of Eric and Mark and Bob and Jane and whatever. And we call those people identities. But where the real work happens in the cloud is the non-people or the non-human identities, your roles, your service principals, your machine identities, the things that run the services. So getting an inventory of that, which is a key security strategy inventory. But then more importantly, computing their permissions, their end-to-end permission. What can the user Mark actually do in the cloud? Can the user Mark hop on a VM that has an identity itself and use that identity to cross from a non-production environment to a production environment and steal the data? So you compute those identities. And so that's the big thing. What are my identities? What are they access to? What can they do? Then you need to answer the data question. Where is my data? Which again, sounds easy. It's easy for me to say. It is not a very easy task to do, especially without the right tooling. And then second of all, what is my data? So finding where all your data is in the cloud and then identifying where's the data that matters most to us. And then from there, I tend to pivot into the what Gartner calls CSPM or platform security. Is my cloud configured securely? And this is another one of those elephants you can't eat all in one. So finding a starting point, finding a framework that works for you, or finding a level that works for you, and saying, okay, where do we need to be from a basic configuration standpoint? How have we just made sure that we've got no gaping holes in our cloud? We've followed best practices. We've locked things down. We've turned encryption on, et cetera. And then lastly, the last thing I recommend is workload protection or vulnerability management in the cloud. Everybody's familiar with this in the data centers. Everybody's got a vulnerability management program. Everybody's got a vulnerability management scanner, and using that as you would on-prem, but in the new cloud paradigm. And so those are sort of the first steps, but recognizing that this is a big challenge. Like I've been doing cloud security for almost 8 years now, and it's an ever evolving, ever growing thing. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. So from the technical, sort of tactical, operational, that is a starting point. And then as a CISO, as a business leader, as an executive in the company that you work for, forming those relationships with the teams that are responsible for the cloud, because those dynamics have changed a lot as well. Before, the security teams maybe ran the firewalls or ran a lot of the security tooling. In this new world, we find that the clouds teams, the DevOps teams, name your cloud center of excellence, name your team, they actually run a lot of the tooling, a lot of the things that happen in your cloud. So building those relationships with the teams, because they're going to be the ones that are going to have to fix the problems that they likely created. But without those relationships in place, you're not going to get very far as a CISO in the cloud. That's for
sure. Thank you for that. You mentioned kind of 4 key areas that you would initially look at. And you start off with identities and kind of doing an analysis of, what's out there. Could you go back through those 4, starting with identity, and talk about some flags that when you're doing this discovery, piece, this is a flag, or these are some common issues that we see in this particular area. And here also throw in some best practices.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the biggest flags, and again, in the identity space, a really tactical good starting point is privileged access certification. So once you have the right tooling and however you do it to be able to, and this is key, I'm going to say this many times today, continuously monitoring. So doing old school inventory of identities every 6 months, every 180 days, every 360 days, that makes no sense in the cloud because things are changing so fast. So once you've got this continuously inventory of your identities going, and you've been able to compute their end-to-end permissions, again, in your cloud or across clouds, find the ones with the highest level permission, your top level accounts, the ones that have the equivalent of full admin or given full admin in your cloud or whatnot, and have a certification process for those. Should this have this level of access? Yes or no? I mean, that's a dichotomous answer. It should or it shouldn't. For the ones that should, go through a certification process, which most organizations probably already have if they came from the data center world. And so that's a really big thing. That's a big red flag, looking for those identities that have the equivalent of full admin or start.star or whatever you want to call it, and asking, should it have this? And if it does, certify it. If it doesn't, then you've got a problem. The next level is then trying to, and I'm going to use the word least privilege, but I know that's a very overused word in the security space. Take the next level down of the ones that you've said no to. Okay, so obviously they have some level of high level of permission. Figure out those ones. Why do they have that level of permission? And figure out maybe why they need such a high level, and see if you can get it at least down from a star.star, a full admin. And in most cases, what we find is they still need a high level of permission. They just don't need full admin level. And if you can do those two things in the identity space, you're off to a rocking start. Put a process around it. And you're off to a rocking start. And why I say start there is because a lot of organizations already have these processes from their legacy data center days. And if you're new to the cloud, then this is definitely a key part of the security strategy you need to have.
Is this the area where also, when somebody wants to elevate privilege, you would force, an extra layer of authentication or anything like that? Is that part of this process, or would that come later?
Well, part of the process is if you're continuously monitoring and doing the inventory and calculating like what we like to call the effective permission, the end-to-end permission, with the right tooling, you can see if somebody's elevated a permission. If Mark had, no permissions yesterday in production, but all of a sudden tomorrow I calculate the thing and boom, the alarm goes off and says, well, wait a minute, Mark's not now got full admin in production and can access this data. That's where the tooling comes in the cloud. And that's a big step, right? Having those things looking for control failures or these changes in the cloud are very, very important, because all it takes is for somebody to make a mistake in an infrastructure as code and deploy something out or configure something wrong, or put something in the wrong group sometimes. And all of a sudden you've gone from a lockdown state to a very bad state. And these things are very, very complex to detect without tooling on your own. They're pretty, I don't like to use the word impossible, but they're pretty near impossible to detect without the right tooling in place and not get buried in the noise of everything else.
Gotcha. Okay. If you want to just keep going through the remaining three, that'd be awesome.
Yeah. So if you look at the next piece is data, again, you have to identify where your data is. That is key, because, the story I always tell is I walked into an organization once that was full in the cloud, and I said assembled the team and got them together. And I said, okay, I'm Eric, I'm your CISO, I'm great to be here, blah, blah, blah. Can somebody tell me where our customer data is? We collected customer, data from our customers that was actually their customer data that we analyzed. And it's very, very sensitive stuff. And so sure enough, the cloud architect got up on the board and the security architect got up on the whiteboard together. They drew this wonderful, great picture for me of our architecture. And they said, there's where our data is. And I was like, no, that's where our data is supposed to be. Can you tell me that when I have a policy that says data is not supposed to move from prod to dev to some staging account or whatever, that didn't happen? And so, eyes went to the floor, and the answer was they couldn't answer the question, right? They knew where the data was supposed to be, but not where it was. So you have to do that. So, a red flag to me always is that, we don't have that monitoring in place to be able to check for if you have a piece of sensitive data. Again, this comes back to when you classify your data and identify what you really deem is important, not everything. But when that sensitive data is sitting in the place that it's not supposed to be, that's a key red flag for me that you need to have in place. And if you flip the coin with the identity piece, where that data is stored, the really, really sensitive stuff, do you know who or what has access to it? Mm-hmm. Do you know that Mark coming from a non-production account actually has read, write, delete access to our most sensitive data store? So you can kind of flip the identity thing on its head and look at it from the data lens. And again, a red flag to me is if they can identify the sensitive data store. If they can't, that's a huge red flag. But if they can, who has access to it, what has access to it, what can they potentially do with it, because there's your risk. And then what are they doing with it? Did Mark actually execute a delete command yesterday? Because that's your incident. And that's sort of the data piece. On the CSPM, the cloud, the platform security piece, the biggest red flag is always, are you following some security framework? Choose your framework, whether it be CIS, whether it be cloud security, whether it be NIST, whether it be whatever you want to choose. If you're regulated, maybe you're forced to go down a certain route. Do you have that in place? And the question I always ask is, have you looked at your controls and have you actually cloudified them? Because a lot of organizations I see coming from the data center take their controls and sort of just try to implement them in the cloud, and it doesn't always make sense. And I come back to a customer, one of the largest banks in the world that I've been working with for many years here at Sunry. They actually came up with their own cloud security standard based on these standards. But for every single control, they made sure they were very specific to the cloud and were very clear about how they could monitor those in the cloud. So yes, that's an advanced state to get to. But if you don't have something to work off of from a platform perspective, that's a huge red flag. And you need to be monitoring the basics.
Can you give an example of where a control for a data center doesn't translate to the appropriate control for the cloud?
Well, I think one of the ones is audit. In the cloud, there's a lot of levels of audit in the cloud. You can get a massive amounts of logging in the cloud because they track everything. Is it turned on? I mean, we see that all the time. Is it actually turned on? Another big one is encryption. Again, is encryption enabled on the data store? And then the last one is is the data store made public? In the data center, our networks form the boundaries of our security, right? But in the cloud, it doesn't work that way. You could put a setting on an Azure data store that actually gives it a public IP that someone with the right tool on the outside, you could download it, I could download it, we could search, we could point it at a web, a set of IPs and check it, and they can find it. So that's another area where it's don't rely on just the network to be your boundary. You really have to think about your identities as your boundary, and the platform configurations as your boundary as well. And it's not surprising that those examples are also the ones when we hear in the news about, hey, so-and-so had an S3 bucket on the internet or an unencrypted database backup sitting in a public bucket somewhere on the internet. These are the real world things that happen when you don't do that.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then in terms of vulnerability management.
This is, this is one of the areas where I see people try to lift and shift their VA program right from the on-prem. And they'll usually take their scanner that they have and they try to use it in the cloud. And I get it, right? I mean, you're trying to sweat your assets. You're trying to, not have to build out this new program. But in the cloud, it's kind of changed. I mean, these scanners often scan on a periodic basis. And resources in the cloud aren't always static. Sure, you have some static resources, but there's a lot of ephemeral resources that could come up for seconds or minutes or whatever. And so you really need, tools in that area that can identify when a VM or a resource comes up to be able to scan it when that happens, and also not to be able to scan it with an agent. A lot of these old school technologies had a static scanner on static servers with agents that reported back, and they would say, hey, we're great. And in the data center, I did that for years and that worked. In the cloud, what happens is not only are you missing things because of that, but you also have this false sense of security. So maybe you're only seeing 20, 30, 40% of your environment with your static scanner, with your agents, with your whatever. Well, you as the leader, the security leader, reporting up to your executive team or your board, yeah, we're good because this is what the scanner is telling me. And what I see a lot of the times is when we use sort of a cloud-based approach to do this vulnerability management, we find that it's well, geez, you're missing, 50% of your environment. And guess what? That 50% you're missing is a hot dumpster fire mess, right? And what's worse is these executives have to go back to their executive teams and their boards and say, well, we've been telling you for 2 years that we're fine. Well, guess what? We're actually scanning half of our environment. And so that's one area. Another area that I find is, of course, these scanners are going to find all sorts of things, especially with the prevalence of open source software used these days. Everything seems to be a critical, everything seems to be a CVSS score of 9 point whatever these risk and context. So yes, that VM might have a critical vulnerability. But again, when we look at the four pillars, is that VM attached to the internet? So, I call it CWPP, but vulnerability management and platform. Well, yeah, okay, it's not attached to the internet, so it's not a problem. Does it have an identity on it that is highly privileged? No. Does it have access to data? No. So that 9 raw score in the context of your cloud might not mean anything. Now let's pivot to talk about a very, very well-known breach that happened a couple of years ago, and I'll use this context. Let's say you have a VM that has a vulnerability. And in that case, I don't know what the level of vulnerability was, but I always use the example. Let's just say it's a media, something that probably nobody really cares about these days. So you've got a score, but then that VM is attached to the internet. Okay, well, that raises the risk profile. Well, let's say that VM now that's attached to the internet has an identity on it because, in the cloud, you have identities associated with these resources. And let's say that identity has privileges to reach from a dev account into a production account to touch a data bucket. Well, all of a sudden your risk level just really, really, really went up. And let's say that data, because we've done our identification and classification, is really, really sensitive banking information. Let's use that example. Well, when you put that all together, that box attached to the internet with the identity that can access everything that's vulnerable, when you put all those risks in the context, that's probably one of the most important things that a security team should be focusing on in their whole environment, in the noise of thousands of other things. But when you look at any one of those things in a silo, and especially when organizations don't look at things in context and treat them in silos, things like that get missed. And that's how that organization likely found themselves in a lot of trouble that we all know a lot about.
So if they had the appropriate tool in that scenario, I'm assuming there's some degree of automation to kind of connect the dots and say, hey, you know what? This isn't just a vulnerability. This is a vulnerability that has exposure to the internet and also has an identity that gives it access to these other critical assets.
Yep.
So what does that look like on the dashboard? I mean, is a flag pop up? Is there something that actually explains it all? What we're actually seeing?
In terms of Sunray, I mean, that's where we get in the context of blast radius. So we use that term of if something bad were to happen, how, from the military term, how big would the blast radius be? That's exactly it. So you would see that, here's this workload. And as you put the pieces, the context together, you would see this rather large bubble in red saying red identity, red exposed to the internet, red vulnerability, or maybe yellow vulnerability. I use the medium, and red because it's data, and that would bubble it right to the top. Any good tool should also set the criticality of that alert or whatever it is that generates in whatever alerting mechanism that it does. But point being, whatever tool you're using, that should really shoot up red flags and say, hey, listen, like somebody really needs to look at this, because in context of our cloud and everything we've analyzed, this is a big problem.
And then do you give options for remediation?
Absolutely. So, at Sunray, in all of our controls, we call them policies, but all of our controls, not only do we say, here's the problem, we give details of the problem, why it's a problem. We give options for remediation that the organization can take. Now, of course, some of it has to be generic because we don't know the exact thing. But also in the cloud, one of the big things that I always preach a lot to security teams, and I know organizations hate the word automation and, they think it's cool, but nobody really uses it. You have to work at the speed and the scale of the cloud. If it really is a critical problem, do you want to fire off a ticket and wait for that ticket to end in someone's, process and ticketing mechanisms for someone to look at, to someone to investigate? Or if you know that it's a problem, if it's something that you've identified as a big problem, like, hey, we've got an S3 bucket or an Azure data store in a production account sitting on the internet, I would say that probably almost every single organization in the world would say, no, we don't want that. Use automation to fix those problems at the speed and the scale of the cloud. Close it down, shut it down. And then if it's really needed, you're going to find out. But I'm more of the, take the action, ask for permission. If I shut down a public bucket in a production account using automation, that was agreed to, of course. But if it broke something, I'd rather say, well, listen, we were taking a risk-based approach and we did what we all agreed we were going to do. Oh, but now we know why this thing needs to be public. Then we can go through the appropriate steps to risk management, create an exception, whatever you do. But again, it comes back to using the cloud is so powerful for businesses because of automation, because of what you can do using infrastructure as code and all this great automation. Security teams really need to start adopting that, and organizations need to let their security teams and their operational teams supporting the cloud adopt that as well to solve problems, not just create, applications and widgets and workloads for the business. Because if not, you're never going to stay ahead of it. You're going to be so far behind that you're just going to be, it's like a Sisyphean challenge. You're never going to solve the problem.
Awesome. Based upon what you see, what percentage of companies, or you could say customers or prospects, are 100% in the cloud versus some sort of hybrid?
I would say across prospects, customers, even people I talk to in the industry and the work that I do with CISOs, a lot of organizations are very, very hybrid. You're seeing a lot of organizations making the shift to the cloud in various degrees. And then some have made the shift and said, hey, we're going to actually be in this hybrid model for a while. One of our largest customers, a Fortune 50 company, said, hey, we've got 22 data centers globally. In 3 years, we're going to shut them all down and go fully to the cloud. So that's one extreme, but most of it falls in the middle of that Gaussian curve of we've got some on-prem and we're kind of moving to the cloud and somewhere in that process. At the other end, you've got your board in the cloud, like Sunry's board in the cloud and like that. But, most of it's in the middle.
Well, if that's the situation, then does that mean that most of these organizations need a couple different risk management platforms?
I think that, what we see in the on-prem, and this is, of an organization I was at before, we had our security tooling, we had our platforms that were capable in on-prem, but what we needed was something more specific for the cloud. And so I'm seeing a lot of that. I'm seeing a lot of organizations. And it's part of what I advocate sort of as a CISO sort of security strategy as well, having this cloud environment where you've got the right tooling for the cloud. But I'm also a big fan of sweating your assets, right? If you've got a risk management platform that can accept data from other platforms, use what you have, use the processes that you have. Just make sure the inputs are correct. So don't just take tooling from your prem and put it in your cloud and think it's going to solve your problems. Make sure your tooling is correct, and then sweat the processes you have, sweat the assets that you do have from a risk governance. Because a lot of times these things just take inputs and we manipulate them and we come up with a score or a dashboard. And those are perfectly fine to have however you're using them, but just make sure the inputs are appropriate for where they're coming from.
Okay, totally makes sense. Hey, I noticed in the prep notes for our conversation that you would be willing to kind of walk through the LastPass issue and then kind of map that back to how traditional approaches didn't help, but how a better strategy would help. So can you kind of walk us through that?
Yeah. And where I tend to start with this, because this was an ever evolving thing, right? So for many months or many quarters, we saw this thing come out. And really where I want to jump into this story is the last sort of information that came out, where we learned that somehow, some way, a malicious actor was able to get the identity, the password basically, or the credentials for a LastPass vault of one of the DevOps or whatever. And what we know from, I'm going to speak to what we know and not what we hear. What we know is that once they were able to get into that vault, they were able to grab a cloud identity. And this was a very highly permissioned cloud identity. And with that cloud identity, they were then able to get into supposedly LastPass cloud. And again, through the techniques that we've talked about, through whether this identity just had full admit or whether they were able to laterally move, like, hey, this identity has the ability to, assume a role into another account, which then gives it a new set of permissions. They were able to probably move laterally across that cloud until they found the things that they needed. Also apparently what they found was whether it was that identity or some other identity they were able to laterally move to, they were able to get to decrypt the data in sensitive areas so they could then start looking into things. So it all comes back to, again, what are my identities? Do we have a process for them? Do we know what they are? Do we know where they are? Do we know what permissions they have? And we check to make sure that they have, that they need those level of permissions. Do we know what the risk is of those? So what could they possibly do with those permissions? Do we have monitoring and alerting in place to know if those are being used from the identity space? And then when you flip the coin, again, where's our sensitive data? Where is our keys, our decryption keys, or whatever it is? Do we know who or what can access it? So there's your risk. And has that been vetted and checked and double checked and re-inventoried all the time? Is there a process in place where, let's say that the access key that was taken, for example, well, maybe it was used from a completely different location. So are there checks and balances in place that are saying, okay, so there's a risk there and we accept that, but wait a minute, this key is being used from an area we haven't seen before. Maybe that should set off an alarm. So in that case, when we talk about that identity and data being the flip side of the coin, were those checks and balances in place? And again, I want to talk to what we know and not what we speculate, but I think we can kind of infer that maybe some of that stuff wasn't in place or some of that alerting wasn't in place. And if it was, maybe it wasn't going to the right place. Maybe the automation wasn't in place to say, well, wait a minute, this key was being used from an IP that's never been used from, and it's being used to touch a really sensitive data store. Maybe instead of firing off a ticket, maybe that should have been a piece of code, and we call them bots to say, listen, just shut that down for now, because this is suspicious. Now, I don't know what they had and what they didn't have, and I'm not going to speculate, but obviously something happened there, and there were issues that happened. And listen, I've been in this business 20 years. I've been in for information security for 20 years. I've lived through many unpleasant things in my time, so I'm not throwing shade at anybody. But from an identity of cloud perspective, those are the areas of risk that sort of popped up to me when I look at that scenario and what happened and what I can kind of infer from what is public knowledge.
Great. So cover the basics, man. Got to get the basics right.
Yeah. Again, inventory your identities, calculate their effective permissions. Where's your sensitive data? What can access it? What are they doing with it? Answer those questions and do it continuously. And that needs to be the core of your cloud strategy, because that's where
you should make a poster, man. Put it on a wall.
Have a t-shirt. There's a t-shirt right? Or something, right?
Yeah. Hey, what's your sense in terms of the the bad actors out there? Are they, when they're looking at businesses to target, are they doing it because of some external signal that says, hey, they don't have the basics right? Is there something that, or are they just going after random whatever? Hey, you know what? Let's go after XYZ bank or company. Or is there some kind of, hey, oh, look, there's some low-hanging fruit. Let's go after these guys. What's your sense of that?
This is a funny one. I was at a plane one time, sat next to a guy, and we got the usual plane chit chat of, where are you coming from? What do you do? And he just said he was with the government. And I said what I did. And he started asking me some very pointed questions. I'm like, okay, like what agency are you with, kind of deal. But, really, he asked the question the same way. And there's all sorts of, reasons that the bad actors do the things that they do. It could be cybercrime, it could be espionage, it could be nation state, it could be whatever. And each one of those has their own way of doing stuff. So sure, yeah, some of them are just going to spray out looking for whatever they can find, maybe get in there, steal an identity, get on a bunch of stuff, ransom it, and try to get some money, that crimes, steal some stuff. But I think what, a lot of what we're seeing from the more sophisticated stuff is very targeted. The criminals, the cyber, we'll call them malicious actors, right? They know that organizations are struggling with the keeping up with cyber. They know that organizations are struggling with the move to the cloud and trying to secure that in this new world. And so what they're really doing is they're getting smart about the cloud being a really good spot to hit. And they're starting to listen to these podcasts and webinars, just like we give them, learning where the weaknesses are in the organizations. And then if you look at, and I'm not going to name the organization, but an organization in the US a couple of years ago that distributed a certain, commodity, they got hit and they got ransomed and they had some pretty big troubles and they had some things shut down. And other organizations that we've heard about, there are definitely some targeted attacks. And what we're seeing, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, is the criminals are being really smart about what they're attacking. I keep saying criminals, but they could be anybody. They could be nation state, they could be whatever, internal. I mean, that's a big threat as well. They're getting smart about it and they're learning where the weaknesses are in the cloud, and they're learning where organizations are not looking, or where organizations are trying to use old school methodologies to protect the cloud. And they'll say, okay, that covers 80%. So we're going to hit the 20% where they're invisible. And And that's what we're seeing. And we're seeing a lot of attacks. Like you can read Gartner, you can read IBM, you can read, I think CrowdStrike just released something, identities. I think the stat is somewhere well above 80% of all attacks in the cloud, successful attacks in the cloud have had something to do with an identity. And so it just comes back to focus that they know that identities are a big weakness and they're going after that.
Yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is there some sort of external signal that they can pick up on to say, hey, they don't have the basics squared away in this organization. Their identity management is not up to par. So this is some low hanging fruit, because you hear this time and time again that you don't have to be 100% secure. You just have to be more secure than most others, because they want to go for the easy pickings. We hear this. If obviously if it's nation state, they're doing it for typically reasons other than monetary gain or just to mess with you. Okay, and in that situation, they're not going to go away just because you've got the basics squared away. You're going to need to have probably a little bit more advanced security posture. But is there any kind of message or signal that companies can send or shouldn't be sending to signify, hey, you know what? We've got a pretty secure identity management policy going on here, a process going on, versus, hey, everybody, we don't have anything. I mean, are there some kind of leading indicators or things that are very obvious?
Yeah. And I think on the social engineering side really is you look at companies that are talking about how they've gone to the cloud or use the cloud, have been very vocal about going to the cloud. There's a huge signal to, wait a minute. Okay. You guys are in the cloud now. This is getting interesting.
All right.
But then I think it takes just scroll. How would I do it? I would scroll through LinkedIn and see what kind of roles they have. And are they looking for cloud security people? Are they looking for cloud identity people? Like, what are they looking for? What do they have? That's one of the big signals.
We're moving to the cloud, and we desperately need security engineers.
Yeah, like exactly, right? So you see an organization says, hey, we've just, signed a blah, blah, blah with a blah, 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 and we're moving fully to the cloud and we're so cloud. And then they've got 100 postings for cloud security. Well, okay, that's behind the 8 ball, right? You can guess that right away. So that's one of the signals that I would, I would look for if it was me doing it. Then there's technical signals too, where, you can scan these organizations. Are they using cloud-based things, repos and whatever? And some of these tools that I talk about, some of these misconfigurations, go find what their cloud presence is and just go scan it. Oh shoot, they've got a lot of buckets exposed. Okay. So that kind of tells me they might not have their finger on the pulse here. And then you start to dig in, right? If I were to scan a company that just went to the cloud that has a lot of postings for cloud security stuff, and I find that they've got a whole bunch of data stores made public, I'm going to go, okay, this is probably a pretty ripe target. I bet you there's a data store that has something really, really valuable. So those are some of the sort of social signals, and then some of the more technical signals that I would look for if it was me doing this, for sure.
That's a great observation. Hey, maybe last question here. Could you explain a little bit about Sunry's name? Because one, it's an interesting story, but two, I'm concerned that if people are listening in and they want to find out more information about Sunry, they're going to try to spell it. And I think you should explain.
Sure, absolutely. So, our company's name, Sunry Security, and Sunry is Irish Gaelic for data. Our CEO happens to be Irish. Brendan Hannigan's his name. And so when him and our co-founder, Sandy Bird, were creating the company, they named it Sunry Security, and it means data security. And that's what we're focused on, is securing, the data in the cloud and making sure that you're secure. But if you're looking for us, it's SONRAI security.com. So just so you don't get the name and the spelling confused, like we talked about.
Awesome. And I definitely will put links in the show notes to your homepage. Hey, any exciting developments or anything else you want to talk about for Sunry in the remainder of 2023?
I think for the remainder of 2023 is again this focus on that data and identity piece. We believe that needs to be the core of your cloud security strategy, and what we're working for every day is to make ways to bubble those risks up, improve the analytics, so you really see that blast radius. So as I like to say, is picture it as you get 1,000 spears pointed at you. You as the CISO needs to know that's the one I need to deal with. And that's what we're constantly striving towards. And then not just showing you that there's a problem, but helping you fix the problem, helping explain the problem, and helping you give the tools, whether it be through automation and remediations that run automatically, preventions that you can put in place to stop things from happening. We really want to work on both sides of it. It's not just say, hey, you've got a bunch of problems, good luck. It's like, hey, here's a problem. Here's a bunch of problems. Here's your biggest risk. Here's how you can potentially solve it on your own. Or by the way, if you push this button or let this script run automatically in your cloud, this is how you can fix this on the fly. That's really what we're all about. No security person needs another tool just to barf garbage at them or barf alerts at them. We really need tools that are going to help us do our jobs. And we strongly believe that happens through, again, risk and context and automation.
Great. Hey, actually, I do have one more question.
Sure.
Let's assume that I'm in the market for some type of platform similar to Sunrise, okay? And I'm assuming that you have competitors. What is the number one thing me as a CISO should be looking for in a platform? And you could go back through the ability to kind of manage those 4 different areas, but just number one in your mind, what is the most important thing?
I think the most important thing is risk and context. I mean, that's how I've always approached my role as from a security analyst all the way up to being a CISO. Is you're always going to have a plethora of information coming in, but you need to identify very quickly where are the biggest areas of risk across, like stepping back and looking at the forest for the trees and then focusing on that. That allows you to say, hey, board, executive committee, whoever you report to, here's the 3 things we need to do. Here's how it breaks down into the problems across those areas I talked about. And then you can put literal programs and budgets and programs in place to fix it, as well as to show your steps. Because if not, it's just a wall of red. And what are you going to do? You just feel lost and overwhelmed and pretty bad every day. And nobody wants to feel that way.
It's like checking my emails on Monday morning after a 3-day weekend or whatever.
Exactly, right? You need that
like,
one
oh my
thing.
God, where do I start?
You need like an algorithm that bubbles that one most important email up to the top.
Anything from my boss goes to the top. My boss or my wife. Hey. So, hey, Eric, it's been a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on Secure Talk.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark.
Hello, welcome to Secure Talk, your trusted source of information on the latest threats, trends, tools, and technology related to cybersecurity and compliance.